For centuries, the ancient world appeared stable. Empires rose slowly, cities endured for generations. Trade routes stretched across deserts and seas, binding distant cultures into a single, functioning world. And then, almost everywhere at once, it stopped. Palaces burned, cities emptied, writing vanished, trade collapsed. Not over centuries, not even over generations, but within a single human lifetime. Around the year 1177 BC, the most advanced civilizations on Earth began to fail together. Egypt, Greece, Anatolia, Mesopotamia. Not conquered by a single enemy, not erased by one catastrophe, but undone by something far more unsettling, a breakdown. What disappeared was not just power or wealth, but the very systems that made civilization possible. And when the dust settled, the ancient world did not recover for nearly 400 years. The question historians still struggle with is not who destroyed this world, but how a civilization strong enough to dominate continents could unravel so completely and so quietly. To understand the collapse, we must first understand what existed before it. The Late Bronze Age was not a primitive world. It was an international system, arguably the first globalized age in human history. Egyptian gold flowed north. Tin from distant mountains traveled thousands of miles. Copper from Cyprus fed workshops across the Mediterranean. Kings wrote letters to one another as equals. They negotiated marriages, exchanged gifts, and called for aid when trouble arose. Diplomacy was formal. Warfare was calculated. Power was centralized. Bronze made this world possible. But bronze required two materials, copper and tin, that almost never occurred in the same place. No kingdom could produce it alone. Every blade, every tool, every weapon depended on trade. This dependence created prosperity. It also created fragility. Across the region, great powers dominated the landscape. Egypt controlled the Nile and its grain. The Hittite Empire ruled Anatolia from fortified capitals. Mycenaean kings governed palace states in Greece. Assyria and Babylon held the ancient heartlands of Mesopotamia. Each civilization was strong. Together they were interdependent. And for centuries the system worked, until small disruptions began to appear, at first barely noticeable. The earliest warnings did not look like collapse. They looked like inconvenience. Shipments arrived late or not at all. Cities reinforced their walls. Armies were mobilized more frequently. Letters from rulers survive that sound uncertain. Requests for grain, appeals for military assistance, warnings of unrest along borders. Some cities were abandoned without signs of battle. Others burned violently, their ruins sealed beneath layers of ash. At first, these events seemed isolated, but archaeology tells a different story. Across vast distances, separated by mountains and seas, destruction layers begin appearing at nearly the same time. Not one collapse, but many, and none of the old solutions seemed to work. Armies still marched, kings still ruled, the system still existed on paper, but something underneath it was failing, something structural, something invisible. As the decades passed, the cracks widened. The messages preserved on clay tablets and temple walls grow more urgent. Kings no longer write as confident equals. They plead, they warn, they ask for help that never arrives. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire, once one of the great powers of the age, struggles to feed its people. Grain shipments fail to arrive. The royal archives record famine, not abundance. In Greece, the palace centers that controlled trade and production begin to fall silent. Their great halls collapse into ash. Their administrative systems vanish with them. In the eastern Mediterranean, coastal cities fortify desperately. Harbors once filled with merchant ships now prepare for attack. And then, emerging from the shadows of history, a name appears. Not a people with a homeland, not a kingdom with borders, but a movement. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples. They arrive not as diplomats, but as families on the move, men, women, children, carrying weapons, possessions, and ships. According to Egyptian inscriptions, they come from the islands, from places already destroyed. They do not raid and retreat, they migrate. Cities fall in their path. Ugarit burns, Ashkelon collapses. Coastal strongholds vanish almost overnight. To ancient observers, it looks like invasion. To modern eyes, something feels wrong. Because the Sea Peoples do not behave like conquerors building empires. They look like people fleeing one. For decades, the Sea Peoples were treated as the answer, a single enemy, a clear cause, a convenient explanation. But archaeology refuses to cooperate. Some cities were destroyed before the Sea Peoples ever appeared. Others fell without any sign of invasion at all. And Egypt, the empire that famously defeats the Sea Peoples, survives the encounter. Weakened, yes. Exhausted, certainly. But standing. If the Sea Peoples caused the collapse, why didn't their defeat restore the system? Why did writing disappear across Greece? Why did trade networks remain broken for centuries? The deeper scholars look, the clearer it becomes. The Sea Peoples were not the origin of the collapse. They were part of it, a symptom, not a cause. Which forces the question to widen. What kind of pressure could destabilize every major civilization at once? What could push entire populations into motion? What could make the most powerful system of its age fail everywhere, almost simultaneously? The answer does not lie in one disaster. It lies in many. By the late 13th century BC, the late Bronze Age world was under assault from multiple directions at the same time. Climate records show prolonged droughts across the eastern Mediterranean. Rainfall patterns shift. Harvests fail. Famine spreads quietly before it ever becomes visible in ruins. Earthquake storms strike fault lines running through Anatolia and the Levant. Cities already under strain are physically shaken apart. Trade collapses under pressure. Without tin, bronze cannot be made. Without bronze, armies weaken. Without armies, rebellions spread. Palace economies, designed for stability, not flexibility, prove brittle. When supply chains break, they do not adapt, they freeze. Local elites lose legitimacy, populations lose faith, internal revolts erupt alongside external threats. Each failure amplifies the next. A drought weakens crops. Weak crops undermine trade. Trade failures destabilize politics. Political instability invites violence. This is not collapse by conquest. It is collapse by complexity. The late Bronze Age world was efficient, interconnected, and prosperous. It was also fragile. Once enough stress accumulated, the system did not bend, it shattered. And because every major power depended on the same networks, no one was left strong enough to rebuild them. Yet this is not the end of the story, because collapse did not mean extinction. People did not disappear. What vanished were palaces, bureaucracies, writing systems, and centralized control. In their place, smaller communities survived, sometimes better than the empires ever had. Without massive trade networks, societies adapted locally. Without rigid hierarchies, power decentralized. For centuries, history would later call this a dark age. But darkness implies absence. What followed was not emptiness, but transformation. Iron replaces bronze, new cultures emerge, old myths remember fallen cities as legends of a lost age. The collapse stripped civilization down to its essentials, and from those fragments, something new slowly formed. By the time writing returns to Greece centuries later, the world is different. Kings rule differently, trade moves along new paths, technology spreads more evenly. The memory of 1177 BC remains buried beneath layers of myth and silence, but its lesson endures. Civilizations do not fall because they are weak. They fall because they become too dependent on systems they no longer understand or control. The Late Bronze Age did not end in a single year, but around 1177 BC, the ancient world crossed a threshold it could not return from, not destroyed by enemies, but undone by itself.